Washington will stage a diplomatic boycott of the 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing. The announcement comes ahead of a virtual summit on democracy to be hosted by U.S. President Joe Biden starting tomorrow. That would be Thursday. For more on the latest events on the diplomatic front, I have Professor Min Jung-hoon from the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. Welcome back, Professor Min.
My pleasure.
I also have Professor Im In-jung from Koongju National University. It's a pleasure to have you back, Professor Im.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Right, Professor Min, let's begin with the reason behind Washington's decision to refrain from dispatching a diplomatic delegation to the Beijing Winter Games.
Well, as you mentioned, the Biden administration announced that it will not send any of the diplomatic or the official representatives to the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics. And the White House said that the U.S. will diplomatically boycott the Olympics, mainly because of China's human rights abuses, specifically Chinese government's ongoing the genocide and the crimes against humanity in Xinjiang and other human rights abuses. I think basically on the surface, it seems that the U.S. government is making sure that it will not let go Chinese human rights abuses anymore, and because human rights is the universal value that U.S. cares about. But I also think that the diplomatic decision shows that U.S.-China strategic competition is still ongoing and even getting tougher and deeper, although the two countries recently agreed to make a cooperation in several areas like climate change, international trade, Taiwan and North Korea at the virtual meeting between Biden and Xi Jinping. And I think that U.S. is taking advantage of the human rights issues to show that U.S. political system is superior to Chinese system, and U.S. also want to use the human rights issues to mobilize its democratic partners and allies to track the rise of China. So I think that China's human rights issues will be deeply discussed in the upcoming Summit for Democracy and will be used as a way of connecting the participating countries to each other. So anyway, it seems to be inevitable that the U.S.-China relations will be colder and tougher in the coming months.
Right. Professor Im, as Professor Min has just said, Washington's announcement to boycott the Games comes ahead of the two-day virtual summit on democracy, which will be hosted by Mr. Biden, as I mentioned earlier as well. Now, pundits believe a number of countries will share their intentions to join the U.S. boycott campaign, and Australia, for its part, has already announced such intentions. What are your thoughts?
Well, the New Zealand was the first one, and the Lithuania also joined the decision. And as you just mentioned, Australia raised their hand. So now, as of now, 4 countries, well, in addition to U.S., 3 more countries already decided on the diplomatic boycott. Probably Western European democracy might consider this decisions very seriously. For example, again, the United Kingdom, or France-like country, they will consider very seriously. I'm not 100% sure about the Germany's position because their situation might be a little different from, again, the United Kingdom-like country. Or Japan is another probably interesting case to think about because their position is in a very difficult position too. You know, like Korea, for Japan as well, China is the first, the largest trade partner. So economically speaking, they are pretty much dependent on the Chinese market and their industries as well. But at the same time, Japan's this ruling party, again, the Liberal Democratic Party, they are pursuing for pretty much, how would you say, they have a different strategic calculations from more like a liberal or progressive parties in Japan. So having said that, Japan probably, they might be hesitant to take the diplomatic boycott, but probably they can. There is a possibility they can downgrade the level of the diplomat they're going to send to the Beijing Olympics. Again, we'll see.
Right,
we'll see the situations.
Professor Min, the Chinese embassy in Washington, for for its part, has called the diplomatic boycott pretentious, while the foreign ministry in Beijing has said the U.S., and I quote, will pay a price for its boycott of the Winter Games. What acts of retaliation might Beijing be planning?
Well, as expected, the Chinese government strongly responded to the U.S. diplomatic decision. And it seems clear that Chinese government will take countermeasures, because if Chinese government does not take any countermeasures, it will definitely get in trouble domestically, and it will also send a message to the international community that Chinese government accepts or admits the human rights problems or abuses in its territory. But it's not clear at this point what options Chinese government will actually use. First, I think the Chinese government will not send its diplomatic representatives to the 2028 LA Summer Olympics. And it could be the most appropriate countermeasure in the principle of reciprocity. But this option takes too long time, 6.5 years to go before it takes place. So I think that along with the possible diplomatic boycott of the LA Summer Olympics, Chinese governments will also consider other options that could take effect in a short time period. So specifically, I think that China maybe will boycott making cooperation with the U.S. that it agreed at the virtual summit between Biden and Xi Jinping, like climate change and international trade.
Right, I see. Professor, let's now turn our focus to the upcoming virtual summit on democracy, which will start tomorrow, Thursday, of course, with some 110 nations at the invitation of the U.S. President. What are the implications of this upcoming summit?
Well, I'd like to bring back the article written by the then candidate, Biden. Last year, spring, he published an interesting article, the why America must lead again through the foreign affairs. According to that article, that was a kind of prelude of the Biden administration's policy. And he highlighted, I think, 2 points. One is, he definitely wants to restore middle class in American society. So he emphasized America's foreign policy should be for middle class, should be for strengthening the middle class. And at the same time, he also emphasized, America's leadership for global governance should be restored too. So having said these 2 points, I think this upcoming summit is definitely for that 2 purposes. Again, it does have some implications for the domestic audience, absolutely. And at the same time, he also wants to show that, again, America is now back on the head of the table. That was actually subtitle of his article. But he is now, America is back on the head of the table. And now they're going to show, we are back for the global governance. Mm-hmm.
Right, so the purpose of the upcoming virtual summit, Professor Min, is quite clear. And yet there is quite a bit of controversy with regard to the invitation list. Now, among those on the invitation list to this virtual democracy summit are Taiwan and Ukraine. Having said that, some observers believe the summit itself seeks to counter China and Russia. What are your thoughts?
Well, as I briefly mentioned earlier today, I think the Summit for Democracy is a way of the Biden administration bringing its allies and partners around the world together. Right? So I think the Biden administration perceives that democracy has been threatened by the authoritarian regimes like China and Russia, and the U.S. is responsible for restoring democracy around the globe. And I think the democracy and the universal values like human rights provide the political and diplomatic ground that democratic countries and possibly some other countries that U.S. is necessary to bring together can work together. And based on the common ground, the Biden administration argues that democratic countries and partner countries need to set international norms and principles over authoritarian regimes specifically in the high-tech industries like semiconductors and the batteries. So I think that Biden administration continues to emphasize democracy and universal values like human rights to mobilize its allies and partners around the world in other areas the U.S. will fiercely compete with China in the coming months and years.
Right, and as Professor Min has mentioned about U.S.'s intentions to mobilize its allies, among those on that list now, Professor Im, are Brazil and the Philippines. Both leaders, of course, have engaged in certain actions that challenge democracy. What are your thoughts?
Well, COVID-19 pandemic changed the world. For example, digitalization was accelerated. This fourth industrial revolution was accelerated, which means, all this geoeconomics or geopolitics can change a lot. Many experts said so. But the thing is, if we see there's all this, the participants list, it reminds me of the Cold War situations. Again, for example, Zbigniew Brzezinski, one of the most, well-known strategists of the United States. He has that famous book, Grand Chessboard. That reminds me of that book. So again, the Philippines is definitely important, strategically speaking, right? Because it's literally in the South China Sea. In Brazil too, if you think about the BRICS, the countries who worked together, probably U.S. might have another calculation, right, to handle again the so-called threat or challenge from the China. So even though the United States, Washington doesn't explicitly say that this is against the China, but implicitly, I do think it's already shows its intention.
Right. Meanwhile, Professor Min, do tell us a bit about Tuesday's virtual conference between Mr. Biden and his Russian counterpart, Mr. Vladimir Putin.
Well, first I want to say that I don't think first the timing of the U.S. Russia the virtual summit has I don't think that it has much to do with the upcoming Summit for Democracy. I think it's possibly and mostly the coincidental. And instead, I think that having the summit has more to do with the current Ukraine situation. Recently, as you know, it is known that Russia increased its military capabilities around its border with Ukraine, and so the U.S. and its European allies are deeply concerned about the Russia's military moves and another attack of Russia toward the Ukraine in the coming months. So I think that the two leaders of the U.S. and Russia just mainly exchanged their opinions about the current Ukraine situations, and they just confirmed their own postures and opinions about that. So they failed to make a compromise or they reduce the gap they have over the issue of Ukraine. So the U.S. the President Biden just emphasized the possible the economic sanctions if the Russia attacks the Ukraine, and Russia doesn't want to take the burden about that. So they just exchanged their opinions.
Right. Professor Im, the U.S. meanwhile has also stressed that there is no pressure on its allies to pick a side amid its tensions with China. How do you interpret this particular stance?
Well, I think we can take it just as it is, because U.S. now, the Biden administration, they do have an intention. They don't want to twist the arms of their allies, like their predecessor did. So in that sense, I want to take it just as it is. Of course, Washington might be sympathetic with the situations of Korea-like country or Japan-like country. Again, economically speaking, we are very much dependent on China, and strategically too, we definitely need the support and help from China whenever we deal with the North Korea-related issue. Washington knows this situation very well, and they know, I think, our difficult position. But the thing is, we need to be very careful because we don't want to be offensive to anyone, right? So this is probably a very difficult situation. So probably our wisdom, we definitely need our wisdom here. How can we really
navigate these waters?
Exactly.
Right.
Thank you.
Professor Min, Seoul and Beijing, meanwhile, are working to arrange a virtual summit now. When do you suppose will this meeting take place, and what are its implications amid the standoff between Beijing and Washington?
Well, personally, I think that the virtual meeting between South Korea and China will be held before the Beijing Winter Olympics, possibly around the January next year. And personally, I think that the two countries have their own interest to have the summit around the Beijing Winter Olympics. First, on the Chinese side, under the situation where the U.S. will diplomatically boycott the Beijing Olympics, and the other Western countries possibly will join it. So China badly wants South Korea to send its diplomatic representatives to the Winter Olympics. And to that end, the holding a summit with South Korea could be a useful way of encouraging South Korea not to join the diplomatic boycott. Meanwhile, South Korea want to use the Beijing Winter Olympics as a momentum to facilitate the resumption of the nuclear talks with North Korea and revitalize the Korean Peninsula, the peace process. And as you know, China has been playing an important role in the North Korea coming out to the negotiating table, and China can also contribute to making progress or moving forward for the end of war declaration. So the bottom line here is that having a summit will contribute to the maintaining a good relationship between South Korea and China. And when we consider South Korea's national interest, on the basis of the strong alliance with the U.S., maintaining a good relationship with China is also important for South Korea to preserve its own economic interests and strategic values between U.S. and China.
Right. Professor Im, just as Professor Min just mentioned, the Moon administration, that is, has been pushing for an end-of-war declaration on the Korean Peninsula. How do tensions between China and the U.S. look to affect this peace initiative?
Well, originally, again, all the series of Olympic here in East Asia, Pyeongchang, and then Tokyo, and then Beijing, we expected that the series of these Olympic Games can be a very good chance for us, and not only for us, for anyone here in this region to just accelerate the dialogue with the North or with anyone who needs the dialogue. So, but the thing is, again, the corona pandemic changed the situation, dramatically changed the situation. So Tokyo Olympic was like that already. And considering the Omicron variant, Beijing Olympic, I want to be optimistic, but I cannot be that optimistic having had all the situations. So COVID situation is definitely one big negative variable. So having said that, again, I'm very, sorry about all this bad timing. Again, this incumbent government is ending, and all this Korea's society, our society is all focusing on the upcoming election. So, and the U.S.'s, decision is already pretty much obvious. So having had all this situation, it looks like it's very, very difficult to expect the declaration can be made. Mm-hmm.
I see. All right, Professor Im, as always, thank you very much for your thoughts, and Professor Min, thank you very much for your insight today.
Thank you.